in almost any other circumstance, there's nothing I would like to talk about better than my time as a game store owner. But now that I'm trying to film it to give some of my insights and ideas and experiences for people out there that work at a game store or own a game store or might like to own a game store one day, it just seems very weird and elbowy. So hopefully this isn't completely unbearable to anyone that's interested. And I know it's a little off the beaten path from what we normally do here on Retro Dojo, but yeah, I've got more than 10 years experience as a game store owner, and I thought I would share that experience with all of you. And maybe that would be interesting, helpful, I don't know, whatever. But over the years, you amass all this knowledge, and then when you don't have anything to do with a game store anymore, it just kind of feels like that knowledge is languishing. People that own game stores, when you talk to them one-on-one, and at least in my experience anyways, they don't seem to be real open to getting the information from you, and maybe it's because they think you're being presumptuous, like, well, I know everything, and let me tell you my time as a game store owner, whippersnapper, I don't know, whatever. This all started back in the early 2000s, way back in the early 2000s. Just weird to think that this was, more than 20 years ago now that this little seed was first planted. But initially, Gamer Sanctuary was opened by my cousin, Davey, and our roommate. And it was an idea the three of us had when me and Davey shared an apartment. Our buddy was over. We were talking about how awesome it would be to own a game store and run it, and it'd be cool. And Davey came up with the name Gamer Sanctuary, and we're like, oh my gosh, that's an amazing name. That's definitely what we have to call it. And Davey and our buddy was a little more ready to jump into it than I was. I didn't feel like we had the money or the planning, and it just didn't feel right to me. So I stepped back and I said, you guys go ahead, my blessing. Do whatever you want to do with it, and, wish you the best of luck. And they did open the store. They opened Gamer Sanctuary in Durand in the early 2000s. I want to say around 2003. Anyways, they opened their own store, and, they did the best they could, but they didn't really know anything about running a store. I didn't know anything about running a store at the time. So they did the best they could, and it ended up being, like, primarily Davey, I think, was doing most of the legwork with our buddy kind of jumping in here and there. But at the end of the day, most of the workload seemed to be on Davey from my perspective, and he just couldn't do it. He was working a full-time job, and then he would leave that at 5:30, open the store at 6, be there till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning sometimes, doing gamery things. They would do LAN parties and stuff. That was a thing back in the early 2000s. So he had that going on, and, he was starting to get somewhere, but every time he seemed to kind of get his feet under him, something would knock the wind out of his sails. And I won't get into all that because that's kind of his story. But at the end of the day, he decided that it was just going to be too much burden, so they closed Gamer Sanctuary. Oh, and I want to say it had to be a year or two later that I thought I would really like to give it another go on my own and see what I could do with it. But I knew that the planning wasn't great on Gamer Sanctuary version 1, and so I wanted to be prepared when I went into this. And I don't remember how I got in touch with him, but I got a hold of a guy that used to own a game store in Jacksonville, Florida, and he had sold it, and he was writing a book on how to run a game store. And he gave me a pile of advice. He helped me write a business plan, which I think is an absolute must for anybody that's looking to open a store. And it's something I hadn't even considered, and I thought was a complete waste of time when I first started doing it, but it ended up being foundational to the success of the store. And even though I've long since sold it, Gamer Sanctuary still exists today in Flint, Michigan, some 17 years later or whatever it is. I think they just celebrated their 17th anniversary. So he helped me with that. He answered a lot of questions. One of the big things that Davey and his partner didn't really understand, and I didn't know at the time either, was how game distributorships worked and how you signed up for them and you got registered for organized play. There's a lot of things that go into running a tabletop game store that you don't think about. And he answered a pile of those questions. So I was able to get a business plan written up. I was able to get accounts set up. He helped me with negotiating commercial leases, which was a huge thing. I didn't know, I'd rented a few apartments before and basic leases on that kind of stuff. I've never ventured in the world of commercial leases, and that, it's its whole creature. That's a whole other thing. And if you are going to get into this, find someone that understands commercial leases, because there's a lot to know. But he was a big help, pushed me in the right direction, helped me get this all set up. So early 2006, I put together a business plan. I started creating the idea of what the store was going to be, mission statement. And at the end of 2006, I had remortgaged my house, and I'd also gotten a small business loan. And even though it was the one thing my wife didn't want to do was signing paperwork right before Christmas, the week before Christmas, we were signing the lease to what would be Gamer Sanctuary on Miller Road in Flint, Michigan. And then I quit my job of 10 years. And Davey, who also worked there with me at the time, he quit his job. So now Davey was my responsibility as well. And we went to Flint, took the Christmas vacation off, and then starting in January, right after the first of the year, we rolled into the Miller Road location and just started building it out. And that's a big part of opening a store. And I knew going in that I did not want your generic game store where it's dark and dank and the walls are just some sort of generic government off gray. I wanted something that looked like it was part of a franchise, that looked enticing to people. More importantly, I wanted something that where not just the gamers were comfortable, but, you know, the moms, aunts, uncles, wives, husbands, parents, grandparents of these gamers could come and not feel awkward or out of place. They could come and shop and enjoy as much as they could, and then the gamers, of course, would love it as well. So we started building that in 2007, and we hired drywall contractors, we had painting contractors, all kinds of stuff that I didn't really want to deal with, didn't have a lot of experience in, and limped our way through all of that. And then March 3rd of 2007, Gamer Sanctuary version 2.0 opened for the first time, and it was a hell of an experience. Made a lot of mistakes during that time. Alienated some people that I wish I hadn't over the years by making decisions under duress. You know, there's a lot of pressure on you. A lot of people come in, and if you own a store or work at a store or are planning to open a store, I think you need to know this. A lot of people come into a game store and they think, wow, they don't think it. They say this out loud to you while you're frantically running around trying to fill out tax paperwork and insurance stuff and payroll and fill out papers that you never even imagined you'd have to fill out for like the local fire station, because you have to fill out papers that say, I don't have radioactive waste, I don't have accelerants, I have all these things you don't think about and have never thought about. You now have to have done by the end of the week or whatever. You know, there's always some frantic, mad scramble to get everything done. And people come in and they're like, wow, I would love to have this job where I can just come in and play games all day. And sometimes you have to try really hard not to strangle those people, because you think, I would love to be able to play a game, let alone games all day, and just while away the afternoon playing Magic or 40K or whatever it is. The reality is, to run a good game store, that's one of the last things you do is play games, because there's always something else. You've got reorders, you've got inventory, you've got upcoming releases. And this is just if you're a regular tabletop game store. There's some whole other crazy nonsense that gets integrated into this whole system if you run a comic book / game shop where you've got to deal with Diamond. And back when I opened the store, it was just Diamond. Now it's Diamond, and DC has their own thing set up, so that's weird. And I've owned both, game store, comic book shop, game comic book shop. At the end of our 10 years, we started getting involved in used video games all the way back to like original NES up to current stuff, which was like the Xbox One. There's just a lot of stuff going on. So playing games is not something you get to do a lot if you're doing a good job. And if you're a game store owner that gets to play games a lot, then maybe post down in the comments how you do it all, because that's one of the things I had a terrible time with, was actually having time to sit down and play a game. Maybe I'm just telling everyone in the whole world about owning a game store, which is a lot of work and a lot of times was a huge headache and was very frustrating at times. But when I look back on it now, I have a lot more fond memories than I do of bad memories of it. I'm really glad I did it. It was a fun experience. The one thing I will say that I was not ready for, because prior to opening a game store, I was not a big game store goer. Like, I didn't spend a lot of time at game stores myself. Played a little D&D. I thought miniatures games were cool, but I didn't know anyone that played, so I never got into it. When I lived in Washington State, there was a little comic book shop me and my dad would go to sometimes. And then when I was a kid and we had moved to Michigan, there was a comic book shop that, incidentally, I ended up purchasing when I was older. But when I was 16, would go there and buy issues of Spawn and stuff like that. And there wasn't a regular. I didn't hang out. I didn't get to know anybody at the store. And one of the things that surprised me owning a store was the kind of great community feeling you get from people. And I think that's going to vary place to place, but I've owned stores in Flint, Michigan, Almont, Michigan, and Owasso, Michigan. And while I will say that the store we had in Owasso, which is, it was a bigger town, but it is a little more of a hometown feel, where Flint, we were in Flint Township, so it's more of a commercial shopping district. In Owasso, I felt like there was like a, what would be the word? I don't want to detract from the Flint community, because those guys were a great bunch of guys. it just seemed more tight-knit and maybe more like a family than just a community of friends when we were in Owasso. You know, I don't know. That's the feeling I got. And like I said, I don't want to detract from a lot of the great people I knew when I owned Gamer Sanctuary in Flint, because that was a really cool community too. But I think I have a fondness for the community in Owasso. It felt closer, I guess, for lack of a better term. You know, during that time, I learned a lot. Like I said, I played a little bit of D&D, and a little bit, I mean, like twice a year, maybe I'd go over to my cousin Davey, who was my roommate. His brother Jason, also my cousin, coincidentally. Interesting how that works out. He would run D&D every once in a while, or not D&D, but he did role-playing sessions. Sometimes they were D&D, sometimes they were other things. And I'd go over and play, but that was like once or twice a year. Played a little bit of Magic when I was in high school, and then kind of forgot about it, like literally as soon as I got out of high school, never touched it again until I opened Gamers. Didn't even know anything about it. In fact, when we opened Gamer Sanctuary and I called the distributor to place an order, and I said, oh, I think I should have some boxes of Magic. This is, you know, kind of like how naive I was about the retail gaming world at the time. I knew Magic and D&D were important, but when I was placing my first order, I was just sort of blasé, like, I guess I should have some Magic. You know, people said I should have some Magic. Oh, a stick fell on me. Or was it a spider? I don't know what it was. Anyways, so I thought, well, I guess I should order some. I should have, you know, a little bit of Magic, whatever. And what was it? It was the last set in the Time Spiral block had just come out. Future Sight. Future Sight had just come out. And so she said, Future Sight had just come out last week. Do you want any? And I said, yeah, I guess a box would be a good idea. You know, which is just humorous when you look back on it later. You might be rolling out of your chairs laughing if you work at or own a store yourself, because, you know, a couple years later, I'm ordering, you know, Magic by case loads, like almost a half a pallet of cases. Just, you know, a case has 6 boxes in it. I'm ordering a box, like maybe I should have some, like a couple of packs, but I'm thinking, how many can you really sell? And then just a couple years later, I'm ordering, you know, like 15 cases of the stuff, which that's not even a big order for some game stores. Some game stores order way more than that. So that's kind of what we were dealing with in the beginning. Didn't know what we were getting into, but we had a lot of fun. I got really lucky that there was only one other store in the area, and I'm not going to mention who it was, but at the time, they weren't doing a lot of the stuff that we were doing. They did Magic, and that was kind of their big focus, was Magic and HeroClix. And we were doing Magic, but we were also doing Warhammer and 40K and D&D and a lot of the other stuff. And we were a much bigger location, so we had the latitude to offer gaming space. We also had a LAN center, because as I mentioned before, the early 2000s, LAN centers were kind of a big deal. And there was a store a guy had kind of become friends with, or acquaintances with, I guess is maybe a better term. We weren't like buddies. But it was a location called Strike Zone in Fenton. And it was just a LAN center. That's all he did, was LAN gaming. And so I decided to integrate that into my game store. Davey had done a little bit with it in version 1 of Gamer Sanctuary, but another guy owned the LAN center, and that was kind of one of the things that tripped him up, is the guy decided to leave and shut the whole store down for like a week to rip all his stuff out and move to another town. But I had built the computers, and we had a lineup across the wall, 8 gaming stations. There's like a program, a special kind of like kiosk program that they had for LAN gaming centers that we paid a subscription for, or whatever. I don't remember what it was called. And then you could pay like a monthly fee or something to Steam and get a lot of the games loaded. Like World of Warcraft, of course, we had on there, League of Legends near the end. Steam would give you access to a lot of stuff like Portal and Counter-Strike and Team Fortress 2 and a lot of jazz. And that did okay for a while. I think it was the mid-2010s. When we finally dismantled the LAN Gaming Center, which in retrospect, I think ended up being a mistake. There's things that you kind of learn and develop over the years, and one of those ideas that I didn't pick up on until a lot later in my game store owner career, if you want to call it that, was the idea of the third space. I don't know why I put that in air quotations, but I got this from Gary Ray at Black Diamond Games in Concord, California. I think he wrote a blog post or did a video about it or something, but it's the idea that people typically have 3 places they spend the majority of their time: work, home, and the third place, whether it's, you know, the local sports bar or, you know, a club of some sort or a game store in my case. And so you want to be the third place, the place where people want to feel comfortable. And the LAN Center kind of gave us that. It gives you an opportunity to have people that just hang out in the store. But, you know, the downside to people just hanging out in the store is if there's no one else there, then the guy behind the counter a lot of times gets the brunt of the conversation. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's also not a great thing to have happening, especially when you're paying an employee to be behind the counter, sorting magic cards, stocking shelves, doing whatever they're supposed to be doing, helping customers, and there's a bored customer there looking for conversation. It's hard for them to be attentive to anything else without seeming like they're brushing off the customer. So the LAN center gave us a little leeway with that because people could sit down and play. But I like the idea of a lounge where customers could gather and hang out, go through their books or their codexes or manuals or whatever it is. You maybe have a gaming console or something there where people can play some games, just something light, something that keeps them entertained, but you want people to hang out. You want them to be there. That's kind of the point of the store. Every minute somebody spends in the store, you have higher chances that they're going to buy something, even if it's just snacks and drinks. So getting rid of the LAN station, it was probably, I don't know if the goods outweighed the bads or vice versa, but so we had that for a while, got rid of it. We had miniatures tables, which I had built, and we had just regular card tables. And the one thing I found out is, and I don't know if this is true at every store, if you work at or own a store, let me know. I'd actually be really curious to see or to hear other people's feedback, but I encountered this clash between what the miniature players, let's say lovingly called card flippers, and the miniatures players themselves. Is there was always this they didn't get along. Every once in a while you'd have a miniatures player who also played Magic, also played Pokemon, something like that. But typically the card players were their own group, and the miniatures players were their own group. And even the board gamers were their own group, and the role players were their own group, with a 1% crossover with somebody playing a different game. Until you got into role-playing and miniatures gaming. That seemed to have a free flow back and forth. Miniatures playing and board gaming was not quite as much as role-playing, but there was still a fairly free flow back and forth. Collectible card games, and collectible miniatures games for that matter, even though there's not really a lot out there other than HeroClix now, but at the time, Wizards had a Star Wars collectible miniatures game. Dungeons & Dragons was a collectible miniatures game. Of course, you had HeroClix, you had Mage Knight, you had Dreamblade. HorrorClix were really cool, actually. That's my favorite clicks. But a few. Monsterpocalypse was a collectible miniatures game at one point. And then they didn't do great, for miniatures players didn't like any of that stuff typically, which I thought Monsterpocalypse might do a little bit better because that was owned by Privateer Press, who also did War Machine and Hordes. And at the time Monsterpocalypse came out as a collectible miniatures game, we had a very strong War Machine and Hordes community, and some of them got into Monsterpocalypse because it was a Privateer Press game, but for the most part, there was a distinct separation between them. And over the years, you just kind of learn things, you do them differently. In total, I've owned 4 stores. I've opened 2 of them from scratch, and I've purchased 2 of them. And they're all their own weird experience. I could get into that more in a different video if anyone cared. Gamer Sanctuary, of course, I opened from scratch. That was the first one I ever opened, and at one point, there was a gentleman, and there's some controversy behind this, so I'm not going to get into it too much, but he had purchased a store with some inheritance he got, and he wanted to be trained by me. I wasn't really interested in doing that, and so he said, what would it take? And I threw out a number. I said, well, if you pay me this much money, and, we absorb your store into the Gamer Sanctuary family, then I will train you how to do it, but you'll be an employee and blah, blah, blah. Either way, it didn't end well. He didn't know what he was doing, and that's not a jab at him. He legitimately didn't know. He'd never run a store. He was a younger gentleman. I'm not blaming him for that. He just went into it without any knowledge at all. And so by the time we had taken it over and tried to reestablish it, I felt like the community had already sort of blacklisted that particular store and weren't coming back. They were going to a different store couple miles away in the next town over, and through different circumstances, whatever, that gentleman ended up parting ways with Gamer Sanctuary. It was not terribly amicable, but it happened nonetheless, and his store became my store. It was Gamer Sanctuary in Almont, and then we just absorbed it into Gamer Sanctuary, paid out the lease that he had at that location, and so that was kind of a thing. It was not a great ordeal. The store never did very well. Overall, we had employees locally that were Almont's 45 minutes away from Flint on a good day. So I had employees that were not super jazzed to have to drive out there on the shifts that they had out in Almont. It was I don't recommend it. It was very weird. So then I think it was in 2018, 2019, 2018. I don't know, 2018 or 19. We opened a second store in Owasso, Michigan called the Game Store of Owasso. And we did a little bit of used video games. It was a small shop. It was very small. And it was doing okay. And it was in the same town of my old childhood comic book shop, Funny Pages, which was actually just like a block and a half up from where we had opened the game store. And when we opened it, we had, and you kind of, if you understand how this works, you can kind of respect the people for it, because people were coming to us telling us how Funny Pages was going to put us out of business because they're way better at everything. And that's, you know, whatever. You take it with a grain of salt. They love their store. They have a lot of loyalty to their store. And so they kind of felt like we were encroaching on their territory. And by all rights, we were. I mean, Funny Pages didn't do a lot of game stuff, and we did no comic and hobby stuff. You know, he did like model trains and comic books with a little bit of Magic and a little bit of board games and stuff. And we were all board games, role-playing games, and Magic. And 40K. We did 40K out there. Not a lot of it, though. So people were coming over and telling us, you'll never make it. Whatever. Go out of business. And at one point, I walked over and I talked to the owner of Funny Pages, who's a gentleman who'd been running it since I was a kid, and now he was in his late 80s. And I just said, hey, if you're ever interested in selling or something, or you're working out some sort of agreement, maybe we could join forces. I think it'd be a really good combination because we fill a lot of gaps that you don't cover, and you cover a lot of things that we don't cover. So I think it would be a good merger. And at the time, he was not interested. And that's fine. He was like, nope, I'm good. He was very polite about it. There was no hard feelings. We said, okay. Now, about 6 months later, he reached out to me and he said, you know what? I'm kind of getting up there in years and I just don't have it in me to keep doing this. Let's talk. And so we sat down, and this ended up being my fourth and final store, and this is one that we had purchased, in a sense. Like, he basically kind of gave us the store with the idea that we would sign a 3-year lease to rent the location from him, because he owned the building and had his apartment upstairs, and he had the store downstairs. And so we moved the Game Store of Owasso into Funny Pages, took it over, and became Funny Pages, which in the history of my game store ownerness, whatever, if that's a word, I have to say is probably one of my favorite stores. Gamers in Flint, I think, will always hold a special place in my heart because that's the first store I ever opened. And I ran that solo for 7 years before selling it to an employee. But then Funny Pages, it was a partnership, but that's where I felt the community was the strongest. And it was the first opportunity I felt like I kind of got to start from scratch because it's a new store. We could kind of do whatever we want within reason. I mean, we wanted to keep doing what would make the Funny Pages customers happy and what the Game Store of Owasso people were expecting. But it was kind of a blank slate. You know, we could kind of play around with it. And it felt like the first time I really got to take a lot of the mistakes I had made at Gamers and not do them at a different store. And Funny Pages was really doing great. Even when COVID hit, we had a little period there where we had shut down, and then we were online only. I did this big mad rush to get everything online so people could buy online. And then we'd have like curbside pickup where we'd set the bag outside and they could take it, go, whatever, do their thing. And then when we opened back up, things were just great. And we were selling a pile of D&D. Like, we carried everything for 5th edition. We had the miniatures. We got into disc golf, which there's a really cool course out in Owasso, and that did pretty well for us. We did some 40K and Warhammer, and we were just really starting to grow that. And we had a nice selection of comic books. And it was in 2020, November of 2020. My partner at the time, we decided not to have any employees. I worked a full-time job at the time, and my partner worked the store, was his full-time job, and he took a paycheck from that. And he came to me and he said, I don't think I want to do this anymore. I want to get a job that has benefits and vacation time and all that stuff. And that wasn't something we could offer. And it didn't look like we were going to be able to offer to him anytime in the near future. So we opted to close down Funny Pages, which was bittersweet because that was my childhood comic book shop. And now I owned it. And now I'm closing a store that's been around for 30 plus years. So that was a little bit of a struggle, but we got lucky. We got very lucky because normally when you close a store, you have to liquidate all of your inventory and then pay everything off and do all this stuff. Well, we decided that step one would be to call any local comic book or game store and see if they were interested in purchasing us out. And as luck would have it, a comic book shop in Lansing had just expanded. They came out, looked at what we had, And they said, wow, you have almost exactly the same product selection as us, with the exception of they didn't do used video games and they didn't do disc golf. I mean, neither of those were huge lines, so it wasn't going to take much to just liquidate it themselves. And so they just bought it all. So we went in the course of a couple of weeks from owning a full-fledged, fully functional, fully stocked, I mean, the store was well-stocked, game store to an empty building. And we negotiated a lease buyout with the owner of the building who had owned Funny Pages. Over our time at Funny Pages, we had made several improvements to the building, and he was actually able to get more rent. We paid, I think, like 6 months out. You know, we're going to close. The end of November was going to be our last month, and then we'd have December. So we paid rent up through June, and he agreed to just write off the lease at that point. And then I think in May, he was able to release it out for almost double, I think, what we were paying. Not quite, maybe 2/3 more than what we were paying in rent because of the improvements we had made. We had painted and upgraded. He had all like old school fluorescent lighting. We'd updated it all to LED. So it was brighter. It didn't have that weird hum that fluorescents give you, you know, like you're in a murder town abandoned factory or something. And so that was kind of an interesting experience, although it was sad because that was the last time I owned a game store. Gamer Sanctuary still exists. One of my former partners runs it. It's still on Miller Road. It's actually in the same plaza. He just moved down a few buildings and rented out a larger space. And I think that's kind of the gist. It was a lot of fun. I don't know if anyone cares about this, but if you do, or if you have any questions, like I said, I've amassed all of this knowledge and I just feel I'm conflicted. I feel like it's a waste not to share it with somebody because I'm not using it, but I also don't want to come across as pretentious or condescending because I'm telling you how you need to open your store. Every store is different. The way I do things might not necessarily work at all for you, depending on your demographics and your customers and the games that you carry, or maybe it'll work great. I don't know. There's stuff I've gotten from other game stores that didn't work well for me and we abandoned it. There's stuff that we've adopted from other game stores that work great. There's ideas that I came up with that worked great, and there's ideas that I came up with that were terrible and we got rid of immediately. So, you know, take it for what it is. If you have any questions, if there's something you're interested in, I would be happy to expand on this. I don't want to bore anyone stiff or turn the channel into how to run a game store channel, but if that's what people like, then that's what I'll do. During my time as a game store owner, like I said, I've opened and closed a number of game stores, and I've run a pile of events. I've come up with a bunch of programs, and probably too many programs. If you ask my cousin Davey, it was definitely too many programs. And looking back on it, it was definitely too many programs. Too many, too fast. So a lot of stuff like that. I'm rambling. I realize it. I don't know if this video is even watchable, but I'm going to cut it together as best I can, and it's getting uploaded Saturday morning one way or the other. So I apologize in advance to everyone that got stuck with my rambling nonsense. But if this was interesting at all, I have literally years of experience. I have millions of encounters that I could talk about, good and bad, silly things that I did, silly things that people did in the store or did to me, ripped me off, were super helpful. It covers the entire gambit, and I'm happy to share it if this is anything anybody's interested in. In the meantime, if you just want to laugh at something silly, then check out this playlist over here. It's just a bunch of funny things that I concocted and made up. A lot of them are just memes I stole and tweaked them, but either way, I think they're funny. Maybe you'll think they're funny. Some people think they're funny. Thanks for watching, and that's all I got. So until next time, have a good one.